Hi, friends. Welcome again to another episode of Beyond the Clouds, Edge to Edge Transformation. We are living in this highly connected world where we are constantly stimulated. It's exciting, but it can be tiring too. And Margaret was a teacher of compassion at the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford. Margaret, tell us about you. How did you end up being this teacher of compassion, and what have you been up to since then?
Thank you, Shankar. Thanks for having me. It's funny how I ended up at that program at Stanford. I like to quote a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche. There's a story that I actually verified with Sharon Salzberg, who was one of my meditation teachers. When she was young, I think in college, and going to India for the first time to practice meditation, she asked Trungpa Rinpoche, very famous Tibetan teacher, one of the first to come to the United States. She said, "How can I find a teacher in India?" And he said to her, "Just follow the pretense of accident." And that's pretty much what I've done in terms of my whole meditation career and teaching career. I followed the pretense of accident to Stanford, which basically means that Thubten Jinpa, who developed it, invited me very early on in the process to help him with the program. I think this was because I was one of the first people who was certified to be a mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher. And he was one of the first people to create a comparable 8-week mainstream program on compassion that was based on Buddhist philosophy. So I think he thought that my background with mindfulness-based stress reduction could help him in thinking through how to do something similar with compassion.
Margaret, what brought you to compassion in the first place? When I got into it, it was just the realization after years of self-torture that there is a way out of this kind of pain. What was it like for you?
I had been focusing on mindfulness practice when I met Jinpa for 20 or 25 years. And within that, we did a lot of formal loving kindness practice, but not so much compassion practice, really, until I got involved with Jinpa and C-Care. But what I found when I started doing the work was that compassion was the medicine that the world needed, that compassion offered the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation through wisdom and kindness and love. And it was clear to me that punishment and retaliation were not effective models of rehabilitation on a kind of personal level, in a relationship with children, in school, in prison, in the workforce. It was incredibly ineffectual. That really what people needed when they didn't act skillfully was love and understanding, and that they might need containment. Certainly, people might need to be separated from society if they're potentially harmful. But when they're in prison or in a timeout or wherever you put people, what they need there is love and understanding so they can recover their own goodness. When we punish them, when we take them out of our hearts, when we refuse to see their humanity, the problems escalate. They're never solved. The whole idea of compassion became very, very central to my value system, my belief about what will make the world function better. I don't think there can ever be too much compassion.
One of the tools you taught us was Aikido communication. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how we can use it in the practice of finding equanimity and compassion?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about the Aikido of communication. And before I do that, just to add that, yes, loving kindness and compassion from Buddhist philosophy are considered immeasurables. They're indefatigable. They can only increase. However, when we're talking about compassion, it's important to add some caveats. One of them is that compassion and empathy are not the same thing. They overlap. Empathy can fatigue. People can burn out with empathy, but not compassion. Also, there's such a thing that, one of my teachers calls idiot compassion. So there are kind of counterfeit compassions that can become problematic, that people can burn out with. So one of the things that we did in the program that you took, Shankar, was to try to describe what the wholesome version of compassion is that doesn't burn out, that can only grow and can only be a benefit to all concerned, including ourselves. Aikido of communication is a wonderful concept that I learned from John Kabat-Zinn in my early days of training with him. John might have learned it from George Leonard, an Aikido master, who took the principles of Aikido, which is a martial art that is focused specifically on the resolution of conflict. So it lent itself beautifully to creating a verbal equivalent of what you do in the physical moves of Aikido. This simple exercise gives you an example, a kind of template in the body of how it might look to relate to a challenging person, let's say at work or even in your family or at home, through the perspective of Aikido. And one principle of Aikido is called entering and blending. Martial arts are pretty brilliant in that they follow the physics of energy on a pretty deep level. So if somebody is coming at you with a lot of anger, there's a lot of energy in that anger. You could push back on the anger, and then you're kind of maybe both stuck head to head. You could run away from the anger, and then the angry person is looking for you and they're still angry. You could collapse the way some animals do, when they're being pursued by a predator and they just roll over on their stomach and say, I give up. And that feels pretty bad. And the person who's angry is still angry. Or you could try this Aikido move that's called entering and blending. And physically, what happens is you actually lean into the person who's angry and very gently turn so you're both facing in the same direction. So now suddenly you're on the same level. You haven't run away, you haven't collapsed, you haven't pushed back. You're on the same level and you're facing together a new possibility. It's quite disarming for someone who's angry to have someone lean in and listen and enter and blend because they're expecting the other three reactions. Anger usually triggers a response in us that's more in the fight, flight, freeze. And this is called fawn, actually, fawn behavior to roll over. So when we're angry, we expect we're going to trigger one of those responses, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And when instead someone actually leans in and really in some ways they are holding a compassionate perspective somewhere in the background that this person is angry because they're hurt and upset, that something really matters to them, that they really care about. They're not expressing it well, and it's hard for them to get their needs met when they act with anger. But if someone can lean in and listen, often the anger very quickly doesn't escalate. And you can together actually listen to what the needs are beneath the anger. And they feel better, and you feel better, and then a resolution is actually possible.
To be able to allow the energy to flow and to become one with that energy is an amazing experience. Which brings me to restorative justice. Have you looked into how it relates to practices like equanimity and compassion?
It's a wonderful movement, and I've certainly been inspired by the truth and reconciliation process. I think was initiated in South Africa. I know it's been used a lot of places, and I think the work that was done post-apartheid by that group is really extraordinary, and it's certainly based on very similar principles. When I was involved with C-Care and the Compassion Institute, we did an ongoing series of programs at Angola at the Louisiana State Penitentiary that's commonly called Angola, the largest maximum security prison in the country. And we looked a lot at similar ideas there around giving the perpetrators a chance to hear the pain of the victims, giving the victims a chance to have their pain witnessed deeply, and an opportunity to receive a genuine apology, things that often are missing and are so important when harm has been done. I'm writing a book on equanimity right now. I've been talking to scholars and practitioners from different religions about equanimity. And I spoke to a Christian theologian, and we started talking about the Black church and civil rights in the United States. And I was thinking about Rosa Parks, who sat on the bus and started the whole bus boycott, which led to a Supreme Court decision about desegregating buses and public transportation. And she was the picture of equanimity. I started reading about nonviolent movements like that are related also to how do you face tremendous conflict and harm without returning the violence? How do you do that? It's a very deep question. You know, what gave Rosa Parks the courage to sit on that bus, the conviction, the strength to do that? I just learned it recently that the architects of the civil rights movement in the United States, the two key architects, actually met Gandhi, went to India, studied with Gandhi. Two theologians from the AME Church, Howard Thurman and James Lawson, were both inspired by the way that he was able to create a nonviolent movement that had so much power.
We would have thought with all the abundance and the technology and all that, we would have learned our lessons, but at least 3 or 4 wars are raging right as we speak. And then there's, of course, the shootings in Maine and all that. Since you're writing a book on equanimity, what would your recommendation be? How can we be equanimous in the midst of all this when people are taking sides and getting more and more polarized in some ways?
Equanimity is more important now than it's ever been. And it seems impossible when we think of Rosa Parks. I think, oh, I'm not sure I could ever do what she did. However, I think we can all take small steps in that direction. In some ways, equanimity is very easy. It involves stepping back and looking at the big picture. It's hard when we're caught in the emotions, but that's kind of the most important time to pause, however it is that you pause. And everybody says it, and we've all heard it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Take a breath, pause. It's important. We pause not to suppress emotions. That's a really bad idea. We pause in order to allow them to peak and to pass away, because until we're no longer in the grips of the emotion, we can't see clearly. And then once we pause, there are reflections that we can do that will create greater equanimity. So simple ones that I like to share, and I'll just say them briefly now, is to think about the situation and to look at it from outer space, to get as much space as you possibly can and see, what does it look like when you step back really far? What is it calling for? Another thing to think about is to remember that things constantly change. And in the light of impermanence, how do I hold this thing that's really bothering me today and right now? Does it look any different? When we step back and look from a greater distance, one thing to consider is future generations. There are a number of indigenous traditions that build this into their viewpoint. Not just what does this mean for me, but what does this mean for my children and their children and their children? In terms of war and the kinds of escalation that we've been seeing, especially in this moment, as we escalate the retaliation from one side to another side with more pain, more loss, more suffering, more anger, what will our children inherit? What will this mean for them? Is it possible, as hard as it may seem, to look for an Iido solution rather than fighting back or fleeing? Is there some way that we can stand, take a seat like Rosa Parks and say, it's not good for our children, it's not good for the world, it's not ultimately going to help anyone if we just fuel more and more anger on both sides, whatever the conflict is, wherever it is. There's another traditional practice for cultivating equanimity that's more on a personal level that was extremely helpful to me throughout my life as a meditator. It's kind of like the 12-step prayer in Alcoholics Anonymous and the different anonymous programs. And it has to do with recognizing that your happiness, Shankar, or my daughter's happiness, or my husband's happiness depends more on your actions than what I wish for you. And that's a very powerful way to begin to step back and access greater wisdom. We get lost, we get confused, especially with the people we're close to when they suffer. And often we try to fix what isn't ours to fix, and we create more problems that way than solutions. So that's another equanimity reflection.
And now that we are in this age of rapid change with technology, with AI, with machine learning, with metaverse, there'll be more devices probably glued to our eyes very soon, especially our next generation, our children. They don't seem to find time to even rest. So, what would be a good way of slowing down and finding that pause that we need so badly sometimes?
It's a big problem. I think we're all aware of that. And of course, there's tremendous benefit that can be reaped from technology and already has been, and I'm sure a lot more will be. And now most meditation practices are available on apps and online, so we can certainly use our technology for that. I was involved in a research study last year. This was a study out of UCSD and the Arthur Clarke Center for Imagination. They're teaching the compassion cultivation training that you learned to residents in the medical school at UCSD. And I was asked to help them develop a virtual reality enhancement for the CCT class, residents for medical students. I thought it was kind of fascinating. Like, how can we harness all this technology for good? And it was quite fun. I got my Oculus headset, they sent it to me, and we had all our business meetings in VR. And we all had our avatars would meet with, green skin and purple hair, and we'd beam up to our meeting room on another planet somewhere. And we would design this research study with all the academics in their crazy avatars. And they were really fun business meetings like nothing I've ever had before. The potential for creativity is unlimited in every direction. We can take these things and use them for our benefit. We can use them for harm. In terms of connectivity and social media and equanimity, one really serious problem is how addicted we are to a certain kind of attention online, to getting likes, to getting approval, and how much that really takes us away from equanimity. That's a really important place to pay attention. In Christianity, Sufism, Judaism, and Buddhism, all of these traditions look at equanimity as a way of not getting caught in praise and blame, gain and loss, fame and disrepute, what Buddhists call the eight worldly winds or the vicissitudes. And social media has created really special challenges for people to be very plugged into external praise and blame. And I think we need to work a lot against that. I think it's pernicious and very harmful for our younger generations, especially.
It's so easy to get caught up in competing, even when it comes to doing good work. Somehow we lose self-compassion, the need for being gentle with oneself. And could you speak to that?
You really nailed it in terms of equanimity and praise and blame, Shankar. So that's great. It naturally we're going to have those reactions to how many likes do I have, how many views do I have, and it's really more about noticing the roller coaster and like, oh, I could spend a lot of energy, but I'd rather invest my energy somewhere else. And self-compassion, yes, we have Kristen Neff and Chris Germer to thank for shining the light on self-compassion and the importance of it, and how easily we forget about it. The self-compassion work is important because we're often taught to offer compassion to others, but not to ourselves. And people even resist it. It's like they think it's selfish or it's self-indulgent. They're afraid it'll make them ineffective or weak. They have a lot of misconceptions about it. And really, it's just about offering yourself the same respect and friendship that you would offer to anybody you cared about. And to recognize that for you to be your best human possible in every arena, self-criticism won't get you there. What will get you there, the same way as with your kids or anybody, is through kindness and understanding. And that it doesn't mean that we take ourselves off the hook and eat chocolate all day, but it does mean that we respond with kindness to our own suffering, with understanding. And even in the small example of noticing how much we're checking views or likes or whatever, to feel compassion for ourselves, for that human dilemma of this is the world we're in. And we're all really caught in this storm of social media and measuring ourselves in this way, and how to feel compassion for ourselves and everyone. One of the beautiful parts of the model that Kristen and Chris developed, it has 4 simple steps. It's awareness that I'm suffering, feeling the suffering, offering oneself just a moment of kindness through a touch or a phrase, and recognizing that we're not alone, that there's no suffering that we can experience that separates us from others. All of our suffering connects us to other human beings.
Even in the midst of plenty, in the midst of this highly connected universe that we live in, we are also in the midst of one of the biggest epidemics. The Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, recognized that as the biggest suffering here of loneliness. Loneliness in the midst of 5G, 6G connectivity, always on. How do we even explain this? It's like an oxymoron, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it is a very dramatic statistic that probably everyone who will listen to this will nod their head and recognize. We all hear that, and it makes perfect sense, as paradoxical as it seems. Most of us have that experience of being lonely with our screens. So the world of likes and dislikes does not nourish the heart. In some ways, we're less lonely if we sit quietly with ourselves in meditation than if we compare ourselves online to others. That's a much lonelier feeling. Now, of course, we also want genuine communication, but what is being offered up for the most part online isn't satisfying that need for connection. Another project I've been working on in the past couple of years is another form of meditation. It's a program that was developed by Tanya Singer, the neuroscientist at Max Planck Institute in Germany. And it's a dyad practice between two people. She's done a lot of research on it, including what she called the Cove Social Project, where she took several thousand people in Berlin during the pandemic, and they did this dyad practice, which was a meditation with another person. And it was very beautiful because it counteracted loneliness. They did it online, so it used technology, but in a very intentional way where people actually connected and really were able to overcome the social comparison that's very isolating and makes us feel worse, and actually speak to one another. And as you were saying much earlier, hear each other and really connect. And they did it for 15 minutes a day, very short practice, and it had huge effects. The program is called Humanize, and there's an app, and there are a bunch of classes that are coming up, and it's in several different languages. It was actually, the platform was built by a team in India.
I'm going to share some of these links to Humanize and to the equanimity practices that you mentioned, the self-compassion, because I think it's time that we find a way to calm down. The long tail of the pandemic seems to be taking its toll in the form of unrest and violence, and also this extreme comparisons. So I'm glad we're talking, and I'm so grateful, Margaret. And to people out there, I'm always looking for different views, different ways of understanding the new reality that we are in, the post AI reality, if you will, with all the technology at our disposal, and yet less time for ourselves, less time to listen and be with someone. So please come forward. Would love to hear your stories, would love to know the thing that gets you excited so we can share and we can learn from each other. Thanks again, Margaret. Such a wonderful time reconnecting with you after many years.
Thank you, Shankar.